Randy Newman of Campus Crusade for Christ tells the story of a young man named Jim who was struggling with his sexuality. Jim was debating whether or not he should tell members of his campus ministry about his struggle with homosexuality, but when another member of the group requested prayer for his gay roommate, the group's director started condemning homosexuality, talking about the gay agenda and they're pedophiles and they're trying to destroy our country and all that stuff. Now, this may be kind of a radical example, but the director of this Bible study wouldn't have had to go nuts and crazy and freak out like this in order to convince Jim that he didn't want to talk to this guy about his homosexuality. A simple look of disgust on his face or a shifting so he can tell he's uncomfortable would have been subtle enough to send the message to Jim that the director of this Bible study was uncomfortable with homosexuality. In fact, Randy Newman has quoted something that Jim told him. He said, "Jim told us he decided then and there that this was not a safe place to talk about his homosexuality. I know another guy who took years to drum up enough courage to tell his pastor that he was struggling with homosexuality, but the very Sunday he'd planned on telling his pastor this, the pastor began his sermon with an innocent joke, or what the pastor perceived to be an innocent joke about homosexuality." And so you have to realize that a lot of times jokes that we think are innocent might just be enough to turn people off to us on this issue. Somebody who struggles with homosexuality is oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes paranoid of being rejected. And if they perceive even the most subtle hint that somebody thinks this is a joke, they won't open up. And this man never opened up to his pastor. And in fact, this man will probably never open up to anybody about this struggle. Many of the gay and lesbian students that I speak to on college campuses are already on the defensive. They are fragile people who've been hurt deeply by the rhetoric of insensitive Christians. In fact, you have to understand there are gay and lesbian people who see Fred Phelps and other pastors who advocate for the death of gay and lesbian people, and they just assume that all Christians are that way. In fact, they may even assume that God is that way. After all, if the only Christians they know are mad at them, God must be mad at them too. I read a book called Blue Like Jazz, and the author quotes a young woman named Penny as she describes her life before she became a Christian. She said this, "I can't explain how freeing it was to realize that if I met Jesus, he would like me. I never felt like that about some of the Christians on the radio. I always felt like if I met those people, they would yell at me." So my point is you have to understand how what you're saying is coming across to people. I mean, I think even some of the angry preachers on the radio are motivated by genuine love for the people they minister to. They just don't realize that it sounds like hatred. I mean, as Christians, we have the most loving message on earth. God sent his son to die so that everyone who believes that he really is who he says he is will live forever. Nothing could be more loving than that. But if the way in which we're presenting this message is causing its recipients to think that we hate them, then we have an obligation to reconsider our approach. And that's really why I wrote this book and why I started my ministry. To try to help Christians understand how to better communicate the love that I believe is there towards the gay and lesbian community in such a way that they can receive it and understand it. That's why Christ became flesh for us. He had to become flesh. He had to put the message in a form that we could understand. Gary Chapman wrote about this in his book, The 5 Love Languages. He addresses the subject of how to communicate love in such a way that the recipients can internalize it. Along the lines of helping those who are struggling with unwanted same-sex attractions, something that's helped me immensely in my own struggle to overcome homosexuality has been healthy physical touch from the men in my church. Touch deprivation is very prevalent among individuals who struggle with homosexuality. Of course, this certainly doesn't apply to everyone who struggles with homosexuality, which is why I use the word prevalent. In fact, there are some guys who struggle with homosexuality that are actually a little bit afraid of touch. They won't even let me give them a hug. Some of these guys have been sexually molested, and to them, hugs aren't safe because to them, touch represents violation. But many, many of the people that I minister to really are just starving for this healthy touch and affirmation from another man. In fact, for many individuals who have a homosexual past, the concept of receiving touch outside the context of sex is almost unheard of for them. A friend of mine, right after deciding to walk away from homosexuality, wrote this. He said, "I wish I could say I was able to end my sexual activity instantly, but the kind of love I needed to heal was not available to me in the closed Christian environment I was thrown into. My homosexual relationships still held the only tangible source of touch and love that I had known, a love I was yet to see coming from God's people." Another man put it well when he said, "As a gay man, I found it's easier for me to get sex on the streets than to get a hug in church." Many of the men that I counsel are desperate for this kind of healthy male intimacy. They will not share their homosexual struggle with the men in their church because they're afraid of being rejected. They too can only dream of being held in the arms of another man and hearing the words, "I love you." In fact, some of these men will literally cry into the phone when I tell them that I love them because it's the first time they've ever heard those words from another man. So why am I counseling these men from hundreds of miles away over the phone when they're all part of an active Christian church? The reason is because the church still doesn't know how to respond. I mean, the church has been making a lot of progress, and I'm speaking in churches all over the country. The church has made a lot of progress. I remember in the 1970s, a lot of evangelical churches wouldn't even let you in the door if your hair was too long. And so we had to have the whole Christian hippie movement birth. And now you can come to church with long hair. But you know what? The church still has a ways to go. Dealing with people who struggle with homosexuality, oftentimes we get uncomfortable around people who are transsexual or people who are struggling with HIV and AIDS because we don't know how to respond. But we're making progress. And you know, I really believe that one of the foundations of making our churches a safe place for people is transparency. Small group leaders need to open up to their small groups about what's really going on, the things that are really torturing their souls, and not just play the Christian game. Testimonies from people who've overcome homosexuality and abortion and drug abuse and prostitution need to be shared on stage in front of the entire congregation because transparency is reproductive. I have a friend named Thor who actually is a youth leader and was a youth leader for about 3 or 4 years. And for the first 2 or 3 years that he was a youth pastor, he didn't share with his high school students that he was struggling with homosexuality. And there were some good reasons that he didn't share. I mean, he explained to me why he didn't share, and some of it made sense. There were some real concerns there. But after a few years, Thor finally decided to open up and tell the men and women in his high school group that he was struggling with unwanted same-sex attractions. And what happened next astounded him. He said there was one person in the group that he found out was struggling with bulimia. There was someone else who was struggling with depression and had attempted suicide the night before. And there were a number of people in his group who were struggling with homosexuality as well. They had never opened up to him. 2 or 3 years. He had no idea they were struggling with this. But when he opened up, they opened up. Transparency is the foundation point. It's the starting point for making our churches a safe place for people. We need to open up about what's really going on because when we open up, others feel like they can open up as well. You know, I was talking earlier about some of the causes of homosexuality, and I mentioned that it's not purely genetic, but there are many other factors that work together to create a homosexual orientation. But I'd like to say one more thing about that if I could. I think it's important for us to understand that science can never change our theology. I mean, granted, science hasn't really been able to find a gay gene, but you know what? I think it would actually be kind of cool if science discovered that homosexuality was purely genetic, because that would just give God even more glory when he sets people free from it. I mean, I remember reading a story in John 9 about a man who was born blind. And Scripture makes it clear that this man was born blind. His blindness was 100% genetic. And of course, the Pharisees spend the duration of the chapter trying to explain away this man's freedom, saying things like, Jesus was a sinner, healed him on the Sabbath, you can't consider this legitimate, he's not really who he says he is, blah, 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 blah. And they approach this man who got his vision back, and they say, what do you think of this? This can't be legit. And this man says, I don't know anything about that. All I know is I was blind, and now I see.